Recording has started.
Do you want to do the intro?
Okay. This is the API review for the persistent and ephemeral CSI inline volumes API enhancement.
Okay. And so I am going to start from being moderately familiar with this, and then as we drill in, I'm going to focus more on the procedural stuff first, just on what these look like, and I might ask a few meaning questions, but it's probably going to stay focused on the technical for this. We're trying to get more of that in the KEPs, and I will talk about places where I'm surprised or something, and it's just I'll kind of talk as I go. Some of the stuff might surprise me, and I'll try to comment about why it surprised me, so folks know. Okay, so usually in a review, I orient myself around the description, so a good description makes a huge difference. This is a use of a mode flag to inline something into CSI. So I usually just jump right into the spec at something like this. So ephemeral inline volumes are ones, and just correct me on my terminology here. So we're going to use ephemeral inline volumes to refer to volumes that exist only in a pod spec.
Correct.
And that has nothing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually ephemeral.
The semantics, well,
the semantics is that the volume dies when the pod dies, like empty there, like secrets, like config map. It's kind of ephemeral.
yeah.
Okay, so go ahead, please.
So the way it works is that when you specify a inline ephemeral CSI volume in a pod spec, there is no volume ID that you associate with it. The volume ID gets generated on mount time, and I think it's generated assuming the pod ID. That way it's unique per pod. So if your pod got deleted and recreated, then the volume ID that comes to the driver is going to be different.
Okay, so the volume driver might still do this. So part of what I'm kind of teasing apart is whether the mode actually ties into something like, is this truly ephemeral? Like, is an implementation required to make the
I don't think so. I think the driver could ignore the volume ID and then just use the attributes that could potentially point to some persistent thing.
And use case wise, I assume, and maybe y'all can tell me if this is the correct assumption. I assume many of the use cases for this are for things that are ephemeral, either per pod, but might live on the host. And so someone particularly clever in CSI might use this to do local sharing between pods in the same namespace by offering an empty dir that is garbage collected when there's no pods from a given namespace running on a node.
Yes, this is possible.
And I'm mostly like it. So I often if y'all know me, I don't know if I've ever, Michelle, I think you and I have gone through this. Sometimes I like to start on terminology. So I don't think ephemeral is wrong. It actually is correct in the context of what you're describing. A lot of the questions I would ask would be, is ephemeral the best word for this? If you could use this to do persistent, and someone would be confused. And so a lot of the questions on naming are, would someone using this understand that the primary purpose? And then if this was intended for a larger set of use cases that are less frequently used, does the terminology confuse them? So persistent actually is a word that we use in a number of other places. Does the meaning of persistent here match the meaning in other places? Like, would someone, like, my assumption coming into this would be like, okay, persistent, that probably means it connects to a persistent volume claim. So if it says persistent volume claim, it has to do with persistent volumes. And if it says ephemeral, it doesn't have to do with persistent volumes. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
That's pretty good naming. And then maybe, usually in a review, I'd be like, okay, driver mode, someone going and implementing a new driver, there'll be plenty of other docs, but like the last resort is always look at the API, because usually that's where people go. So I might say, okay, in this review, I think I'd probably add a comment here, which would be, the driver mode is really important. It would be good to add a little bit of extra GoDoc here, and actually probably in the point of use. So what I would probably say is like add GoDoc here. So because of the way constants work in GoDoc and they don't show up in our docs, I would probably say how the name of the PR.
Oh, there's no inline persistent CSI volume.
Sorry, okay, so then let's say inline persistent CSI volumes are intended to relate to a persistent volume.
I think so. If your driver mode is persistent, then all your volumes can only be used through PVCs. You cannot specify your volume in a pod.
Okay, and that's actually like this sort of like usually what like I'll always try to say like put as much as possible into the constant GoDoc that you can, and then duplicate that. So like so working through the reasoning here, so I would also suggest adding a few examples of what sorts of drivers would use this mode. So an author / casual browser. A CSI driver that downloaded a vault secret and put it into a directory for a given pod might Does this kind of make sense what I'm asking for here?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you might want to also mention a broader scope and the like pod that it's common. And I always try to like come up with examples. So like I actually really care about this feature because I'm going to go abuse this for all sorts of things. And so I have some use cases. Not all API reviewers will always have that, but I do like putting in the comments of the actual API, if it's intended for an extender, what you might do with it. We've rarely gotten to a case where we have too much GoDoc in the API definitions. Temporary garbage collected. That is only accessible on namespace. And then, okay, so usually that's what I would start with, and then I might go down to where the field is. And we typically try to enumerate modes. Where's the API? We typically try to enumerate modes here, and you've done that, so that's great. This is just a minor nit. I'll use mode instead of mode. So just one minor comment, in the comments, always use the JSON form of the name. Like that's the thing that I really wish we had a good automation thing for, but it's practically impossible to write. The doc's great. You tell the default. You list the other modes. I might suggest adding an example of use here. So, again, like adding an example, because this is intended for an extender, adding an example of how they might use it or how an implementer might use this. Because this is used by both end users and this API is most likely to be used by an extender because an end user doesn't ever set this, right?
Correct.
So then I would probably just suggest giving the extender a few examples. Adding more GoDoc here will never go wrong, and duplicating GoDoc you have in other places is usually good because the constants don't show up in the GoDoc the way this will. So a couple of other minor things. So I noticed that this is not using our standard constant style. Is there a reason for that?
I don't think so.
Okay, so then, yeah, that would be like the obvious like other one, which would be like style API constants should always be camel case. So persistent ephemeral. Now, generally we don't do pluses. So like read write many. So I would probably say the third constant should be just and this gets into like if this is an enumeration, coming up with a good name for each enumeration versus appending them is probably what we recommend. We generally do not use complex.
And should it be enumeration? Maybe array would be more appropriate.
I'm sorry?
Maybe array would be more appropriate, like access modes in volumes. You list all the modes that the volume supports.
That probably might be more appropriate, yeah.
Yeah, I think because the only concern with using something like all is if you add some third mode in the future.
Yep, that's an excellent point. So if we added a third mode in the future, we don't want to have to do A, B, C, etc. This seems like an array of supported things. So persistent. So yeah, generally the exception to that would be if you have an external API that you need to fit into. I know we've done that a few places for things like Ceph, storage, and a few of the others, but just it doesn't sound like in this case there's a reason not to put this into the cube constant style. And it is one of my pet peeves that some of the extension frameworks around cube don't use our style the same way. So like Istio uses all uppercase, which drives me up the wall. So it's just one of my pet peeves. Okay, so this actually, from an API perspective, other than those few things, so like, okay, so I would go in, I'd look at the constants, I'd look at the GoDocs. I'd usually keep digging on the GoDoc until I felt reasonably confident that if I did a kube control explain on the field and I didn't know much about CSI, that I'd be able to guess what this is for. So generally, this is not anything that's specific to this team or not, but across the cube space, as explain has gotten better and as our open API docs have gotten better, more people are depending on it. A couple of consoles out there, like OpenShift is starting to add like an API explorer. People who have viewers using open API viewers, adding more description to the actual top level object becomes more valuable. So anything that's a fundamental property of the CSI driver, there's actually a really strong benefit to adding in the GoDoc of the object itself a short snippet about what use cases might be. And we don't strictly enforce this, but it's kind of as people go through cleaning it up. And at some point in the future, I know we will try to go through and clean this up. But it would be, in this object level doc, if this is a new field that fundamentally changes something that someone would describe, the field would be good. I'd get examples in there. And then I would do a higher level meta here, which might be, we can certainly do more than just, a few sentences here. Explain, probably I would say once we get past like 3 or 4 paragraphs, maybe that would be too much, but there's always the opportunity to say, okay, CSI driver captures information about a container stores interface volume driver deployed on the cluster. The CSI drivers do not need to create one directly. That's kind of a more mechanical detail. I might say over time, and we don't have to do it in this review, but just as a general thing is when we go and talk, we can probably do a better job of documenting this, is adding another couple of sentences here about what an extender would do means that someone who does kube control explain CSI driver gets a little bit of a snippet like, oh, a CSI driver, for this case, might be CSI drivers represent the object installed, represent the type of driver, and Kubernetes uses it in the fields, CSI driver spec, calling out the important ones like attach required, or let's see, pod info on mount, attach required. Those are a little bit more mechanical. So mode is the third field. Mode is actually really important because there's 2 different modes now, and they fit 2 different use cases. So I might even say in CSI driver, going and adding here a CSI plugins may have 2 different types of modes: a persistent, which is a volume that is stored with a persistent volume claim and may only be used that way, and ephemeral, which can be created on the spot and can be used for extension of behavior on the node, and then maybe take the examples used in the other places and just do like a really simple declaration. Again, not required for this PR. It's good to be thinking about that always, because if you can answer the question about CSI in this explain and orient people, you probably save yourself time explaining later. We don't require doc links here. I think at some point we might. Some of the original cube objects have a few of those. Down the road, it might be, this would be a great place to have if there's a canonical doc location for writing a CSI driver, I think it should go there. So not required for this, but a good way to think about what's the purpose of the GoDoc and how does it help users.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, just reading that comment, it's already out of date.
And it's funny because I always feel like we spend a lot of time on the API review. I generally feel that the API is the thing that ends up saving you time. So it's like, even though it's hard for us to do, part of the reason that I know Jordan and I and Tim and others have always been so nitpicky is if you answer the question here, you don't have to answer it later. And I think I've noticed, at least talking to people extending Cube, the ones that have more upfront description. I notice I answer a different type of questions. It's not scientific at all, but the great thing is that if you put it in GoDoc on the thing, it shows up in lots of places downstream, and so the extra time just benefits. Okay, so you've got the new mode field. We talked about that. I would generally look at, so we talked about constants, we talked about naming. I'd usually do a double check of your serialization parameters, which people could get wrong. In this case, it looks like you generated it. Mode is the lowercase name. This is all good. It's optional. Emit empty. It's a pointer. That's good. And sometimes I forget which, depending on which release it is, whether pointers are in style or out, but it's consistent with the other fields on this object. And kind of the overall theme that we use is internal consistency within an object is the most important thing. And then, on new fields. So there are places where when adding a new field, we would explicitly avoid, even if it's something that other fields were wildly wrong, we'd probably fix it. But we'd say, you should use the correct. So like if you were to use a Boolean instead of an enumeration, even if everything else on that struct used Booleans, but enumeration was the right thing, because we generally don't like to add Booleans unless they'll never be in other choices. So we would go and say, be consistent as the tiebreaker on things where it's not clearly just broken. So I don't think that applies here. But just as that's like another one, is consistency matters within the API so much, because that reduces confusion, and confusion is a really hard thing to measure. So we just kind of treat it as an axiom and go from there. So somewhat of an arbitrary axiom. I see that there's a new annotation. So this defines, in a sense, the API for that. So this is also an API, ephemeral. So given, is this defined in another spec? Or the annotation?
Not really. We have
This is what we pass. This is actually a CSI annotation, not a Kubernetes annotation.
Okay, because if it was a Kubernetes annotation, I might say, we might just, so when we're passing annotations, if there's an API field that behaves a certain way, we would pass it through the annotation. In this case, because A, we agreed, at least in theory, that this should be an array of enumerations. B, because it's defined in another spec already. And C, because something is either ephemeral or not. So this is probably appropriate, which is the use of ephemeral as an attribute, as a Boolean. So we're converting our enumeration into a Boolean. That's okay because it's a lower level primitive. It's defined in another spec, and it's reasonably consistent. And it would not in the future prevent us, for instance, if there is a new mode type that we come up with in the future that's a variation on ephemeral, there is the possibility that in the future we might have, say in the future we come up with ephemeral required. You could always do an annotation, ephemeral required equals true, even though you wouldn't be able to set both ephemeral and ephemeral required. We generally don't pass enumerations down to lower level extensions, because then we have to go passing an enumeration to something. If they don't handle it, that's a bug. So this is generally fine. That would be what would be going through my head talking through it. It's fine to convert an enumeration to a Boolean in this case. If only if the volume is an ephemeral volume inline defined by the CSI volume source.
Yeah, so I think this annotation only comes into play if your driver supports both persistent and ephemeral modes. Mm-hmm. So this is an indication to the driver whether or not the user is requesting this volume in an ephemeral through in line with the pod or as a PVC.
Okay, and this is required to be sent if it is ephemeral?
It's required to be sent if the driver supports ephemeral. Yeah.
Okay, so if and like I'm kind of like, I think some of this clarifying info is what I was going to suggest in. So existing CSI drivers won't know what this is.
Correct.
So today, do we effectively say today that there's no such thing as ephemeral inline CSI volume sources?
Today it is an alpha feature.
Okay, good. So before a CSI, so let's pick 115. 115, you would not be able to do an inline CSI volume.
You can if it's alpha, if you use the alpha feature.
Okay. And then
but in 115, we only support ephemeral or persistent. So what this change is adding is also the ability for a driver to handle both.
Okay. So as an example, what you're saying is it would be impossible without the gate for the alpha feature to have an inline CSI volume source.
Correct.
Yes.
Which means we do not have to define the behavior of an existing CSI plugin that somehow got this. If there had been a way for someone to half specify this, we would have had, like if we had accidentally added a field that allowed it, even if it didn't work correctly, we would still have to define what the default behavior is for those old plugins. So that's like usually during an API review, because this is a new field. So this is two things. This is a new field, but it is a communication with an existing plugin API. So the new field usually it's got to be optional by default. The default value cannot change the behavior of the cluster generally unless you change the API version. Because you're passing this down, because this is two APIs really, it's the API to the driver and then the driver's API to the tool. An API reviewer just needs to double check that, okay, well, I'm calling somebody else with a new value. We have to define the default. So I would generally say a CSI driver in the wild, passing whatever new we pass can't change the existing behavior. And CSI drivers are allowed to ignore things they don't recognize, which has been the case. So there's not really anything we have to do except say, if this annotation is absent, define the behavior. Absent. So for example, if this annotation is not present, CSI driver must assume not use the RSSL must assume calling CSI driver cluster. And I'm not sure that this is right for the annotation. It might be like a note below because it's going to be kind of tight in the Go doc. But it's important to think through that, what happens when if someone has a CSI driver today and they don't see this value, what can they assume? So in the case here, we didn't send this before this graduated. So it means that if you see this value at all, it means that you're running a version of Kubernetes that supports this. And one of two things is true. If it's true, that means the CSI driver included ephemeral as a mode and this is an inline volume source. If it's false, but if it's absent, that means the feature is not enabled.
Or it's being used as a persistent volume.
Right. support ephemeral line volume sources, and that this volume must be persistent. So the presence of the annotation is required to allow the underlying implementation to assume that. And it's kind of like, I think this is like where I worry the most about API review and transferring this knowledge. Is it's really hard to reason about some of these, and the patterns are, there's a new field in an API resource. There's really something else that's novel here, which is adding a new field to an extension by Kubernetes. It's technically a new field to an existing API resource, but I think there's enough novelties is where the novelty comes in is if you're calling someone else, it's different than if you're writing it to an API object and someone's reviewing it or reading it in subtle ways. Just like if you have a read-only config object that you assume writing is totally out of scope, you can make different assumptions. So this is just generally like we don't have a good coherent rule for this, but think about the things you pass to other people differently than you think about the things that show up in the API, because the nuance of working how that fits. So doesn't have to be. Fancy language. Okay, so that's generally most of what I would go through. I'd probably just double check, optional. If this was an implementation attached, I'd check for the things that are required. So
what are these funny characters?
So what the test data does is it uses fuzzing to generate, does the field values for things that are strings or constants. So generally, and I think Jordan has an example of this, if I go look, you can actually tell it modes to try. So like, just like with the fuzzer, you can provide default values. This would be something that I would probably be like, check whether a specific fuzz for this mode. Some of this is just having data there. Because in the past, serialization has inferred constants in a few cases, bad ideas, but just from a parsing and round tripping perspective, having good fuzzers and so forth is pretty important. And in an API review, I might suggest that you add a fuzzer. So I would go look at, I would assume that you pass the fuzzing. I would probably suggest here that this be a, let's see, what are we doing here? If mode equals nil, I would suggest constants. And because we're changing this from a singleton to an array, it's a little bit more nuanced, but valid values, valid plus invalid values, and empty. So the fact that the fuzzer is defaulting is actually kind of problematic in many cases. I don't know if they actually did that.
So because I think we added a defaulting logic for this field, and it was failing the round trip stuff.
Okay, if you've added defaulting, this is acceptable. So I would probably say above this, instead of letting the fuzzer do, you generally, you can look at the example up here, but like you might, let's see. it's not the end of the world if we don't. However, we have in the past caught things around fuzzing where spending a little bit of extra time on the fuzzer can save effort later. We don't really allow people to futz with constants now. In the very first versions of lots of APIs, the constants might have evolved. We're getting better at it, but just as a general rule, for instance, if rand and to that way, take a chance and then override I don't know how deep you really want to go, but for instance, you can do the, we definitely want it to be
I guess for the are we allowed to let the fuzzer set a nil field if we are defaulting it? Because I think that was breaking the round trip test before, because before we added this into the fuzzer.
So some of the round trip tests should set defaults. The bug really is that it's not the fuzzer that should be defaulting. It is, this is just we've never fixed this in API machinery, but what should really happen is we should fuzz an object in the wild, like as it would be at rest. There should be a round trip test that serializes it and deserializes it with no or deserializes and serializes it with no decoding and verify it ends up in a canonical form. That should not do defaulting. We should then also have a round trip test that, because the round trip test started by testing the internal conversions and back, that's what the current one today does. That does do defaulting. So you have to fill out the defaults, but we could actually move that out and say, take the initial object, run the defaulting test and get the object back. If the object doesn't equal the input object, run the appropriate defaulting, then verify it. However, we can't do that because of some of the older conversion logic. So just for today, we basically do in a perfect world, we wouldn't do defaulting in fuzzers. Unfortunately, we don't live in that perfect world. What will you do is just run the defaulter after it. And we're close to that. Someone would just have to go do it, and no one has taken a chance to do it. So c.ran.string or whatever the helper is here. So this just as an example.
Sure. I guess in this case, though, the case 0, like, we can't do that. Otherwise,
no, you'd be sorry. I'll correct that. So you would do the defaulting afterwards because you have to do defaulting. Just forcing, basically, don't trust the generic fuzzer. Define your own. And I would say what we try to do is actually try to cover as many, because this is fuzzing, we want to cover the logical cases. The default fuzzer does half nil, half not nil, but because we have 3. So you'd still have to do the defaulting. I guess you could remove this, but yeah, you could collapse that code. I don't really care about the style so much. It just, if in the future we go and we take defaulting out of the fuzzers, then it would be easier to snip this bit of code off the end. But that's really up to I wouldn't make a big deal of it. It's mostly just trying to get people thinking about their fuzzers as actual fuzzing. So yeah, I saw the comment about validation, feature gate check. So that's an obvious one. Looks like that's not feature gate enabled. CSI. Yeah, we do direct casts in here. So we have 10 minutes left. Let's see, supports. Okay. So then I generally look at validation. So this I would use, so from a style, this is just a div, but I would just is to collapse my normal nitpicky Clayton stuff.
This will have to be modified anyway if we're going to move to the array.
So this is a pet peeve, and I'm not going to make y'all deal with this, but this is unnecessary. And this is the style that people have done, but at some point, I'm going to have to go and fix all of these. This forces an allocation, which we don't want to do. So validation is actually one of our heavy hitters in update flows. Validations do about 1/5 to 1/6 of all allocations during a update. And that's because our validations are really inefficient for two reasons: field path, which is expensive, and also this. So every one of these will cause an allocation on the heap. And the GoLang canonical way to do this is var all errors field.error list. That'll be nil to start because nil and empty are the same for a slice. What would happen would be you wouldn't do any allocation here. I'm not going to put that comment in because it needs to be consistent across the whole code base. But just as a GoLang style, never initialize an empty array. Always do var or empty slice. Always do var, and then append initializes it as necessary. Validation tests. So, I usually look at validation tests. This looks good. Jordan is a little bit more nitpicky than I am, and he might make you do 30 or 40 tests, which is good. I usually look for something along the lines of testing that you at least exercise most of the branches in there. Do we have a invalid one? Combined mode, terminal mode, precision.
Down below.
Yeah. Okay. And I would probably also test nil. Even though we default it. So not a huge deal, but even though in theory, all the code coming into this should set it, people can use the validation functions on deserialized objects. And so it should fail validation if it's null, the same as if it's empty string. But we don't want it to cause a panic. And so just as a usual rule, I ask people to test the nil case in their invalid scenario, even if it should be defaulted. We're pretty close. This is a pretty good one, other than some minor API stuff. I would have stayed focused at that. I usually go through and do a pass on the code just for the things that you all have already caught. As I saw from the comments, validation, the strategy, the round tripping, and obviously spending a little bit more time on the Go doc for the author is valuable down the road. Usually, and I've gotten more stickler about this as we've caught on over the years, but the more that we can get to a really good Go doc and probably a really good release note, which I sometimes check, I might even nitpick. Once this gets updated, I would go ask this to be a little bit more explicit, just so that when it comes time for the release notes, someone who reads it has a chance. I talked about use cases in the API doc. This is such an exciting feature. This is someone can go use a CSI driver to build a node level extension that deals with a file system, which means they can inject, they can share things across pods securely. They could inject Kerberos credentials. They could add sockets that allow people to talk to a proxy of the Docker daemon. And I personally get excited about that, but trying in the release note to at least give someone a clue what this is helps this stand out. And I think this is actually a cool enough feature because it allows us to extend nodes at a very fundamental level in the manner that we want nodes to be extended. I think that would be probably what I would do in a first pass. Any other things y'all thought of as we went?
No. I think it was very thorough.
And I actually think the discussion on the array is a really important one. So I'm going to make a double note here after discussion in the review call. So did I actually not leave a note on that too? CSI node, enumeration values persistent. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Modes. Actually, and so the fact that we now have it, do we want to call it allowed driver modes? So this is, I get into naming and probably I might recommend
Driver modes.
Yeah, so we could do driver modes, we could do supported driver modes, we could do allowed driver modes. It's kind of implied that it's supported, so driver modes might be the best. Please think about how a user reading this would think about it. I think it's good to put the naming back on y'all to do a follow-up. Looks like we're running at another meeting now.
Yeah, people are joining for storage SIG.
Okay, this was great. Don't forget to stop recording, and I really appreciate y'all's time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye all.
All right, for everyone else on the call, I'm going to end the meeting so that we can start recording the previous session. So you guys will have to rejoin again.